And I'm the incoming executive director for the Kansas Breastfeeding Coalition. We are excited to welcome you to this Empower Talk session. The series provides focused learning opportunities designed to empower and support all of you in the important work you do for breastfeeding families. Our goal is to introduce you to emerging research, innovative ideas, and inspiring professionals from Kansas and across the country. Each session will provide a brief introduction to key topics and resources that you can explore more deeply after the presentation. Before we begin, I would like to recognize Brenda Boundy, our outgoing executive director, whose vision and leadership helped shape and grow the Empower Talk series. We are grateful for her many contributions to breastfeeding support across Kansas and beyond. I'd also like to introduce the Kansas Breastfeeding Coalition team. Amy Trollinger serves as our communication and technology coordinator and helps make these events run smoothly behind the scenes. Carmen Valverde is our program coordinator and will be moderating the chat today throughout today's session. We encourage you to submit questions in the chat, and we will share those questions with our speakers and include their responses and additional resources in our follow-up email. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Meghan Azad. She is a leading researcher in infant nutrition, breastfeeding, and microbiome. She is a professor at the University of Manitoba, Canada's research chair in early nutrition, and the former deputy director of the Child Cohort Study, where she looks at how early life nutrition influences lifelong health and development. She currently serves as their executive committee and co-chairs the Knowledge Mobilization Committee. Dr. Azad, please, we're glad to welcome you today.
All right. Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm going to share a couple slides, so I'll get those up. And I'm happy to share them with you in handout form after the talk. But I'll jump right in. As was mentioned, I study breast milk and the microbiome and its importance to infant health. And so today I'm going to tell you a little bit about some research we've done on how breast milk really sets the pace of microbiome development early in life. So to start us all out on the same page, what I wanted to first establish is that breastfeeding really is the most important factor shaping the infant microbiome in the first months of life. The microbiome being all the good bacteria that live in and on our bodies, many of them in the gut, but also other parts of our bodies, our skin, our nose, etc. So what I have here is actually my first foray into breastfeeding research, and it came through the microbiome. So at the top left here, you see this was my first paper as a postdoctoral fellow, my first engagement with the Child Cohort Study, which also was mentioned. And here we found it was published on the cover of the Canadian Medical Association Journal, which was really fun for us. Also, a fun backstory is that first they refused to even consider this article because at the time the microbiome was a new complicated thing that they didn't think doctors really cared about and it should go in a specialty journal. But we pushed back a little and said, we think this is important actually for doctors to know about. We would like it to be in the medical journal. So we worked with them to rewrite it, etc. But what this paper showed, and then what the subsequent paper showed, which is a few years later in a larger study called the Teddy cohort in England, is what you see on the graph. And so here the researchers were looking at all sorts of different factors early in life to see how much they contributed to variation in the microbiome between different babies. And this big pink bar is showing very clearly that breast milk is by far and away the most important thing. In fact, more than everything else put together. And everything else in this case are things like antibiotics, which we know affect microbes, probiotics. Birth mode is on here. This has been part of my research as well, how a baby is born shapes their microbiome. But really, more than everything else, you see breast milk. And I put up here a little graph showing the number of research studies per year looking at breast milk and the microbiome. And you can see it's really shot up. So back in 2013, it was kind of a new thing, but these days there is a lot of research on this topic. And for me, the big question now, it's been well established that breastfeeding is important for the microbiome, but why is that? Why is breast milk so important to the microbiome? And I also like to pause here and say the answer to this question really does have implications for everyone, not just breastfed babies, all babies, and in fact, people across the lifespan. Because if this breast milk is doing something so important to our good microbes, then maybe the lessons we learn from that can even be applied to other stages of life. So to answer this question, we really have to look at the breast milk. And so these are two pictures telling you the same message. On the right, you probably can't read all the small words, but the point being there are a lot more ingredients, so to speak, in breast milk than there is in the alternative being formula. And on the left, we've zoomed in a bit, and you can see that, yes, formula has the main nutritional building blocks that a baby needs to grow, so the micronutrients and macronutrients in sort of the right proportions. But over and above that, breast milk has all these other non-nutritional bioactive components. So it has antibodies that come from the mother, it has hormones, it has growth factors, enzymes, and so on. And beyond that, I would update this figure from my own perspective to include two other important things, which are probiotic bacteria, meaning live beneficial microbes, as well as prebiotic oligosaccharides, which are essentially food for those good microbes. And you might be thinking, but I've seen the formulas these days, they have those things added to them. And that's a little bit true, but hardly. So it's important to recognize, yes, some of the new formulas today have probiotics or prebiotics added, but in natural breast milk, we have hundreds of strains of bacteria that are naturally found there, and a formula that's adding these will be adding one or a few, and same with the prebiotic oligosaccharides. There's been over 100 different structures of these prebiotic sugars identified in breast milk, and only one or a few are getting added to formulas, and also in much lower amounts than what you find in breast milk. So they're trying, and it's a good goal to get closer and closer to breast milk, but it really, really is not the same. And that's to say nothing of the fact that it's not the same 100 oligosaccharides in the same proportions in each mom. They're different. They're dependent on the mom's genetics and diet and environment. So there's really, it's not something that we could replicate in an artificial formula. All right, so as I said, milk is dynamic. It's not only different between moms, it's changing over time. And so, for example, the immune components in milk are very high early on in the colostrum, and then they drop over time as the baby's own developmental immune system catches up. And that's because those things are also happening on a time scale. So here we have what are called goblet cells in the infant gut. They're growing and multiplying over time. The gut microbiome is also changing over time. So early on, you have high levels of this bifidobacteria that's eating those prebiotic sugars. Over time, other bacteria sort of take over in the infant gut, and other processes are changing along a time scale too. And it's important to recognize that weaning from maternal milk is inducing major changes in the baby's gene expression, their microbiome, as well as their immune development. And these things are all interrelated too. So gene expression is changing the microbes are changing immune development, and sort of back and forth. So it's a complex system is the point, and it's changing over time. So the research I'm going to summarize for you today comes from the child cohort study. This is a birth cohort study in Canada. So I am located here in Winnipeg in the middle, but families were recruited from 4 different provinces across the country. This study started back around 2010. So the infants, I should update this slide, they're actually turning 16 now. We're starting the 16-year follow-up of these babies. So they're clearly no longer babies. We're following all sorts of different outcomes. In the beginning, the questions were really around asthma and allergies, knowing that these develop early in life and they're much more prevalent now than in prior generations. So the question was really like, why is that? It can't just be about genetics. We know they run in families and genetics play a role, but genetics don't change across 1 or 2 generations. So it's got to be something in the environment. So we took a very broad view to look what's in the homes that these children are growing up in, what is their social what is their diet, their mother's diet. And the microbiome was actually a bit of an afterthought because back in 2010 when the study started, this wasn't so much on the radar, but shortly thereafter, people started realizing how important it was. And so fortunately, the study had collected dirty diapers, and that's how we study the gut microbiome of babies. So this study is, like I say, ongoing, and it's the result of a lot of work from a lot of people. So I'm one ambassador from this study, really talking about just one part of it to you today. In a linear view, we see the study started back in 2009. We've had connections with the families at different time points along their life journey. What I'll focus on today is the first year. So we collected breast milk, a stool sample, and this is a Q-tip for a nasal swab from the babies at 3 months when study staff went to the home of each family to look at the environment and collect these samples. And then again at a year, they came into the clinic and provided more samples. So I'll focus on those for today, but the study is ongoing. And I wanted to point out that you're welcome to explore the website. So we have a website, childstudy.ca. This QR code will take you there, and you'll see there's a page called Results and then Key Discoveries. And if you click that, you'll see the key discoveries out of the study organized by topic. So I highlighted the breastfeeding topic here. I think it's still the biggest topic, which makes me very proud of all the different ones. There's a nice video you can check out. And each of these is like a little vignette from a publication we've done. And so to give you some examples, and they're sort of in very easy to digest infographic form. So if you want to read more or even share them with your networks, that's a good place to go. So some of the things we have found is that longer and more exclusive breastfeeding in this study of thousands of families is associated with more gut bifidobacteria infantis. This is a very good bacteria that's been shown in our research and others to be helpful for preventing chronic disease. It's associated with less wheezing and asthma in the children. And we also noticed that pumped milk seems less effective, although still better than formula. So I think this is an important finding, especially in this day and age. And I know I'm talking to most of you are in the US, where pumping is very common because there's no paid leave and moms have to go back to work. So how else are they going to feed their milk to their babies? So I think this research is really important, not to make moms feel bad for all the effort they're putting into pumping, because that's a lot of work and important and still providing benefits, but also isn't the same. And so I think this is a message to policymakers that just giving everyone a breast pump and sending them back to work is not the solution. We also find that certain microbes are shared between mother's milk and infant stool. So there are live microbes in breast milk, not huge amounts of them, but small amounts. And we're finding that that's important. Those microbes are a source of microbes for the baby's gut. They also pick up microbes from the environment, but that's one source. And notably, that sharing doesn't happen as much if mom's pumping. Also, that breastfeeding mitigates the asthma promoting impact of early antibiotics through the gut microbiome. So that's a mouthful, but essentially we find that babies receiving antibiotics early in life in the first few months, they have a higher risk of asthma later on. And that's been shown in other studies as well. But the question was always why? Why would antibiotics cause asthma? And turns out the answer is because they're disrupting the microbiome development at this very critical stage. But what can help with that, first is don't take antibiotics if you don't need them. And we know that often they get prescribed for ear infections caused by a virus. So let's avoid that. But sometimes babies need antibiotics. So what do we do then? Well, we find that breastfeeding is actually really helpful. And that makes sense because it's protecting the microbiome or helping it recover. And then lastly here, I picked another study about maternal secretory IgA. So this is the most abundant antibody that you find in breast milk. And we show that it prevents particular allergy-promoting bacteria in the gut. So there's lots of good bacteria in the gut, but some of them, if they're there in too large of amounts, kind of skew the immune system, and this is one. And by having maternal antibodies in milk, it helps keep it at manageable levels. So lots of different roles and associations for breastfeeding and health in the child study. The one that I thought I would highlight in a bit more detail today is this fairly recent one, which is really focusing in on that timing element. So I showed you how the immune system is changing, the microbiome is changing over time. This paper really shows that what's regulating all those time-changing aspects of development is breast milk. And so here what we did is we looked at the babies, we divided them into two groups, one that was still getting exclusive breast milk at 3 months of age when we took that first stool sample, and another that had already stopped breastfeeding. And in a nutshell, what we found is if they were still breastfeeding, then over the next several months until they became 1 year old, their microbiome gradually increased in complexity. And that's what I would consider normal and healthy. You have gradually over time the microbiome maturing, whereas babies who stopped breastfeeding early had this premature acceleration of their microbiome. It became too complex too fast. And that's not good for the immune system because it's not ready yet. And the end result of that is that those babies were at a higher risk of asthma. So I'll skip maybe some of these details for the sake of time, but essentially this is some fancy math in the study that showed that that maturation of the microbiome in the gut, but actually also in the nose, which is sort of new. Not many studies have looked at the nose microbiome, but in both cases, these microbial communities were mediating a good chunk of that association between breastfeeding and less asthma. So the moral of the story here is that timing is everything. Healthy infant microbiome development is not just about having the right bacteria or the right microbes, it's about having them arrive in the right order at the right time. And exclusive breastfeeding is really the dynamic element that is regulating this intricately structured microbiome development. So I like to show a little analogy. This is a Canadian dessert called an Nanaimo bar. This is one you might recognize better, a tiramisu. But the idea is these are beautiful desserts, right? They require the right ingredients, but not just throw them all in the bowl at once. You have to do them in the right order at the right time. So same with the microbes in a healthy baby. You need all the right microbes, but you also need them arriving in the right order at the right time to get your healthy baby or beautiful tiramisu. So the last thing I wanted to mention and leave you with is that I run something called the Milk Club, the Manitoba Interdisciplinary Lactation Center. We're a research center, so we have a milk biorepository and lots of data, but what I thought might interest all of you is that we also have a club that meets quarterly, and it includes researchers, healthcare providers, trainees. I opened it up after the pandemic to really anyone in the world. So if you're interested in joining us, we do sort of research talks and other things. You're very welcome to. This is where you can reach me. And I will end off by saying thank you to all the many people who contributed to the research I shared today. And I'm happy to take questions. I forget if there's time for that, but if not, this is where you can find me online. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Azad. That was fascinating, and I love that analogy. That makes such sense. If you do have a question for Dr. Azad, please place that in the chat, and we will get it to her so we can help you find the answer to something that you might be interested in knowing more about. I'd now like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Lovya George, who is a neonatologist at Children's Mercy in Kansas City and is the medical director of the University of Kansas's NICU, excuse me, that's how I know it as the NICU. She is a board certified neonatologist in pediatrics, breastfeeding, and lactation medicine. She is also the medical director for lactation services at Children's Mercy and the chapter breastfeeding coordinator for the Kansas chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Dr. George, welcome.
Hello. Thanks for that introduction, Katie. Let me try to share my screen here. I think I'm running into a little bit of an issue. Okay. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, but it's not like full screen.
I know. I think that's what I'm having some
It's
issue
good enough.
with. Let's see. Why is it not coming as a PowerPoint?
Can you do that from beginning, just right above where you are?
Oh, that option was blanked out for a second. Okay, now it's there. All right. So hopefully you can proceed okay now.
Looks perfect.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna move this here. Today, thanks for that introduction, Katie. I wanted to talk about outpatient nutritional care after discharge for a preterm infant, particularly with reference to fortification. Now, this is not a new or novel topic, but I chose this because it's a very hot topic right now, both in social media as well as among medical professionals and among parents. We've had some lawsuits, the NEC formula lawsuits that have been very heavily publicized. There are social media ads that are targeting new parents, frankly horrifying them. So we are seeing more and more parents that are coming in refusing fortification even before we talk about it. So, it's somewhat of a tricky situation. So the evidence around post-discharge fortification is somewhat unclear, and we have to acknowledge that, and we have to be transparent about that. But at the same time, fortification is often medically necessary for our smallest VLBW infants. And with some parents now coming in refusing fortification, even for the smallest of our babies, we are already starting to see some upward trends in osteopenia of prematurity and some concerns for long-term developmental effects. So this is just a clinically relevant topic that I thought we would chat about a little bit today, just about some context around fortification, when is it necessary, and just acknowledging that sometimes we use it when it's not necessary, and how can we address that. An additional effect to this fear around fortification is that because most of the lawsuits are against Abbott and Mead Johnson, which makes sense because these are the two big companies that contract with most of the hospitals in the United States. So by default, those are the products that most of the NICU babies are exposed to. So obviously, those are the ones that are being sued. But because the focus is on those two companies, I think it shifts the focus a little bit away from breast milk versus formula to big formula companies and Abbott and Mead Johnson being the problem. So some parents think that alternate or organic formulas are safe, and ask for those products, which we know in terms of affecting the microbiome. Just segueing from Dr. Azad's talk, effect on the microbiome, effect on neck, and things like that. Alternate formulas are about the same, but at the same time, they might actually carry a higher risk because the monitoring for recalls can be a little bit tricky when these products are not on the formulary, and there might be a higher chance of contamination, especially when you're talking about unregulated imported products. So I just put some news clippings up here where we have had major recalls for some of the most commonly used organic formulas and related to great, I think, widespread outbreaks of botulism in infants, which is very serious. So I think it's important that parents, medical professionals know about that so we can educate parents, and parents should be aware of that too. So this is just some context as to why I wanted to talk about this topic today. So navigating preterm nutrition, I think the conversation, especially when it happens pre-hospital or before the baby is in the NICU, sometimes the conversation the pendulum tends to swing towards extremes. On the one side, there is this thought process that formula is evil and should not be used under any circumstances. And on the other side, unfortunately, sometimes even medical professionals have this stance that all preterm babies need fortification and mandatory fortification for everyone just because they came to the NICU. And we know that neither of these stances are true, right? We should not be adhering to either extreme. And, what makes the safest option and the best option for the baby often lies somewhere in the between, where we have to take a lot of nuances into consideration and then provide the best options for that baby. So I just said that not all preterm babies require fortification. So who does and for how long? So in general, by the time of discharge for preterm babies, most preterm babies show one of these 4 different patterns of growth. So the first case, number 1, is ideal, where the babies are born appropriate for age and are discharged appropriate for age. So they're born, continue to have a normal growth trajectory, and are discharged at a weight that is appropriate for their corrected gestational age. Scenarios 2 and 3 are the most common, where either the baby is born small for born appropriate for age, but then have postnatal growth faltering, and by the discharge time, they have fallen below their growth curve. The third scenario is where they are born small and remain small. So there is IUGR plus postnatal growth faltering. And the fourth scenario is less common, where we have small for gestational age babies who are appropriate for gestational age by the time they're going home. And that refers to some accelerated postnatal catch-up growth, which we now know might be a risk for metabolic syndrome later on in life. So most NICU babies show patterns 2 or 3 where there is some degree of postnatal growth faltering, and there might be a combination of IUGR plus postnatal growth faltering. So this brings us to kind of a delicate situation, right? We know that growth faltering is linked to poor neurodevelopmental outcomes. And on the other hand, we know that accelerated rapid growth after birth can be linked to obesity, diabetes mellitus, heart disease, hypertension, and metabolic syndrome in adulthood. So nutritional support should strike this delicate balance to where we provide them just enough nutrition to grow well, but not too much to where their growth is excessive or it can cause issues later on. So again, there is not a clear evidence to the big question is, who do we fortify? Who do we automatically fortify when they come to the NICU? So a lot of what evidence we have, most of it suggests benefits below the birth weights of 1,800 grams and gestational age somewhere less than 32 weeks around that mark. So that's just a rough cutoff. That does not mean that all babies less than 32 weeks need fortification. It's because less than 32 weeks is when you have those higher needs for calcium and phosphorus and to prevent osteopenia of prematurity. That's the age group below which osteopenia of prematurity is more prevalent. So that's where the gestational age cutoff comes from. And the birth weight around 1.8 to 2 kilos has also been suggested as a cutoff to where the babies might need that extra fortification for caloric requirements. And because this is the general gestational age and weight, that fortification has shown to have the most benefits. So a lot of guidelines kind of give that as a rough cutoff for weight, below which fortification might be considered in the NICU. So this table here is just an example. It's taken directly from the California Perinatal Quality Collaborative. It's a toolkit for NICU discharge. And based on this table, it says birth weight more than 1,800 grams, fortification may not be necessary. Now, that does not mean that there is no circumstance under which a baby more than 1,800 grams does not need fortification. So this is more of a guideline to, okay, less than 1,800 grams, we need fortification, but more than 1,800 grams, we might need to take some other factors into consideration. Again, like I said, these are just rough cutoffs to guide our decision-making. While these cutoffs are helpful to determine initiation of fortification, what decides whether we need to continue and how long we need to continue, that depends on the nutritional status of the baby. And so how do we assess the nutritional status of the baby? And this is a graphic I made based on the ABM Protocol 12, which talks about NICU baby transitioning to home and their nutrition. So this involves a clinical assessment, which should take into account baby's oral feeding capability, their in-hospital growth, and biochemical measures. So the table on the left of the screen here, which shows the biochemical and growth monitoring for preterm infants, it shows what our goals are for weight gain, length, head circumference gain, and then the biochemical markers. And when you assess the nutritional status prior to discharge, we should ideally assess the oral feeding intake, as in, can the baby feed well? Are they growing well on exclusive breastfeeding diet? Or if they are bottle feeding, are they able to take at least around 150 to 160 mils per kg per day and show good weight gain on that? Growth parameters should be normal on appropriate charts, and biochemical measures should fall within the normal for ALK, phos, vitamin D levels, and hemoglobin that I've listed on the side. So if all these if these three measures, feeding, intake, growth, and biochemical measures, are normal, that constitutes an optimal nutritional status. If any of these are abnormal, that constitutes a suboptimal nutritional status. So once we determine whether they're optimal or suboptimal, then we look at, okay, what is their current diet? If they're maintaining all this on an exclusive breastfeeding diet, they do not need fortification. But a lot of times at this point, because they're getting close to discharge, babies are on some degree of fortification. And then at that point, the question is, how do we transition them to less and less fortification and more breast milk, transitioning to going home? And obviously, there's a little bit more of a nuanced discussion because we do have to take into account, does mom have enough breast milk to begin with, going home to sustain that? And so to kind of go make a plan for this, we need to know what we are trying to accomplish, right? And this table on the top here, it kind of shows the general goals that we are trying to accomplish in a growing preemie for calories, protein, calcium, and phosphorus. And the subsequent columns here show that unfortified breast milk feeds exclusively at 160 per kilo per day falls short of those goals. And this column highlighted in yellow is where we are getting close to those goals. So, those are the feeds where there is 5 breastfeeds and 3 22-calorie bottles, or 6 breastfeeds and 2 26-calorie bottles. And I just wanted to put this column here because that is what we hear about a lot from NICUs. Babies go home on 2 bottles of formula. And where does that come from? So that is based on this calculation because that is where we kind of hit that goal close to meeting the goals for energy, protein, calcium, and phosphorus. But not all babies need that. So if the baby is meeting all those growth and biochemical parameters on this first column here, exclusive breast milk feed, that is good. But that is where those 2 bottles come from. And that's the rationale behind most babies being discharged on that. And you adjust that on follow-up. The table here at the bottom is again from ABM Protocol 12, which shows depending on mom's milk supply and how she desires to feed, mostly breastfeeds versus pumping and providing milk and all that, you can achieve the same goal many different ways. For example, if mom has a lot of milk and baby can tolerate higher volumes, if you take about 180 ml per kilo of feeds, some babies eat up to 200 per kilo if they're feeding directly from the breast. That is this last row here. They actually exceed the goals that we have set up here. So, those are some things to consider too. It's not a one box fits all kind of situation. If the mom has more milk, if a baby is able to feed well and tolerate that higher volume, they can do that. Or if you see this option 3, which is breastfeeding plus 15 mils of 22-calorie formula. So just exclusively breastfeeding with top-ups at 15 mils actually gives more calories, protein, and calcium than this 5 bottles plus 2 NeoSure situation that we highlighted on the top. So, I'm not going to go into the details of the slide for time limitations, but just wanted to kind of introduce that concept that we can achieve the same nutritional goals many different ways. So to make a plan for the baby, it's important to take into account baby's nutritional needs, mom's supply, and maternal feeding plan. Does she wish to maximize direct feeding at the breast versus does she just care about providing pumped milk, which from Dr. Asad's presentation, we know it's always best to feed directly from the breast as much as possible. And then we can come up with an individualized plan for the mom and baby. Again, not going into detail about this table, but this is just an example from a publication of how you can individualize this discharge feeding plan based on mom's milk supply and labs and growth. So again, navigating preterm nutrition is not easy, and it's important not to fall into those 2 extremes. And I hope I've provided a glimpse of how we can provide some balanced and safe options while we support breastfeeding and maximize babies' breast milk diet, while at the same time providing them nutrition that this growing preemie needs. And just on one last note, I want to say there is one, I didn't link that study here, but there's a follow-up study from, there's a 20-year follow-up study of former NICU preterm infants that show that because calcium and phosphorus utilization from breast milk is so much better than from formula, the factor that determined the bone density 20 years down the lane is not how much calcium and phosphorus the baby got, but the proportion of feeds that were breast milk. So the more breast milk they had, the better their bone health was. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. George. That is very interesting information. I definitely appreciate it, and I know the audience does as well. Please join me with the reaction button and thank both Dr. Azad and Dr. George for their time with us today. We so appreciate it. As a reminder, we will have our next emPOWER talk on July 15th. Dr. Azad will be back with us at that time. And so be looking for those invitations. Hopefully you have those on your calendar. Also just want to share, check out our socials and our website. There's lots of exciting things happening from the conference to scholarships opening. Please take a look at the website. And we're just so thankful that you guys are here with us today. We hope you have a great day.